Cities in the Arctic have long been the agents of colonization, built by settlers mostly for resource extraction and expansion of geopolitical power. However, settlers arriving to tame nature have developed attachment to place, and for many, it became their home. Adapting to extreme climate and environment, settlers domesticated landscapes consciously and/or unconsciously to conform to their images of normal city, values, and aesthetic preferences based on available resources. These practices and experiences may serve as sources of resilience in the age of the Anthropocene, when human ability to transform nature has reached the highest point. This session aims to elaborate on human-nature relations in the Arctic cities using art-science collaboration to mutually reinforce both research and creative processes. Current advances in technologies, economies, and mobilities have prompted scientists to propose a new geologic epoch, the Anthropocene, which emphasizes human ability to change the Earth with emergent risks of the planet becoming inhospitable for human habitation. The main questions for humanity in this context are how, in our efforts to domesticate landscapes, can we make them safer, more productive, better for living and viewing, and preserve them for the well-being of future generations. At the global scale, the most evident feature of the Anthropocene is climate change induced by human activity. Since the pre-industrial period, the land surface air temperature has risen nearly twice as much as the global average temperature. Climate change has severely impacted food security and terrestrial ecosystems and exacerbated desertification and land degradation. The top of the globe is melting. Since 1979, when satellites began recording the extent of Arctic sea ice, the ice cap's annual minimum size has shrunk by some 900,000 square kilometers, an area roughly twice the size of Sweden. As this environmental catastrophe unfolds, governments, companies, and individuals are racing to secure the riches that are being exposed by the retreating ice. And there is more than just oil and minerals. Archaeological treasures, rich stocks of fish, and lucrative trade routes are being uncovered, as well as a very interesting geology. One of the persisting discourses about the Arctic is the one on a resource frontier. It is especially pronounced at the federal scale, with centers of decision-making being located in cities far from the Arctic. The main impetus for its development has been related to natural resource extraction. As such, it serves as an illustrative example of the capitalocene, the age of capital, the historical era shaped by the endless accumulation of capital. Temperatures near the Earth's surface are warming rapidly, causing unprecedented glacial melt, reduced sea ice in the Arctic Ocean, and permafrost degradation. In turn, these changes are causing complex infrastructure, social, and economic problems in the Arctic, spanning various social levels and spatial scales. Cities in harsh climatic and environmental conditions, such as those in the Arctic, are exemplary for demonstrating changes induced by humans both directly and indirectly. Built environments have the most dramatic contrast with the natural environment and require larger amounts of resources and energy for maintenance. Meanwhile, infrastructure is damaged by permafrost degradation and coastal erosion caused by climate change. In contrast with the dominating Western perspective, maps of indigenous peoples' migration routes and trails allow us to see the Arctic as an interconnected, highly linked place. This contrast between settlers and indigenous perspectives is especially evident in the Russian Arctic. Russian Federation area occupies more than half of the Arctic. On one hand, it is a territory with the most preserved natural landscapes and traditional indigenous lifestyles. On the other hand, it is the most populated region in the Arctic, with the biggest cities reaching up to several 100,000 people. Scientists and artists participating in this presentation are working with communities domesticating both rural and urban landscapes of northwest Russia and West Siberia. The transformation of landscapes in the Russian Arctic has materialized a change in dominating discourses about the Arctic. The idea of isolation from nature clearly reveals itself in architectural projects of the 1950s and 60s. The artificial microclimate, a covered passage between buildings, was supposed to not only defend residents from the extreme climate impacts, but also to embody the modern Soviet city idea. The harsh cold climate and high cost of construction prompted dense urban plan forms. Even single-house cities were proposed, such as pyramids in Norilsk by Shubkov, but these projects have never been fully realized. However, these efforts have helped to normalize the region and its cities as ordinary Soviet living spaces. The main focus of this chapter is on the Arctic and subarctic areas of western Siberia. Arctic and subarctic Siberia is covered with snow for 7 to 8 months a year. It falls in October and stays till late April. Harsh climatic conditions are characterized by winter temperatures in January of around -23 degrees Celsius. During the short summer in July, temperatures vary around 15 to 17 degrees Celsius. Natural landscapes are characterized by the forest tundra and northern taiga biomes. In some parts, swamps cover up to 80% of the area, while forests occupy only 36%. During recent years, the region has attracted large public attention because of its temperature anomalies and wildfires. It is one of the world's biggest reserves of all terrestrial carbon. The region has traditionally been home to the indigenous people of Nenets, Khanty, Komi, Selkups, and Mansi. It is one of the few places in the world where indigenous people, Nenets and Khanty, continue the tradition of nomadic reindeer herding. Currently, this way of life is threatened by climate change and encroaching extractive and infrastructure development. The north of the Tumen region up until the 1960s had only 7 cities. Urbanization in the region, with the construction of 16 new cities, was related to the geological exploration and extractive industries. Extractive industries still dominate the regional economy. Almost 1/5 of the world's natural gas is extracted in this region. Western Siberia serves as the main oil and gas supplier for European countries. These reserves and infrastructure networks elevate the geopolitical role of Western Siberia. We study the settler practices and perspectives of domesticating landscapes in the region, focusing on Kogalym, Nadim, and Salikhard. They have been infrastructure and population hubs for oil and gas exploration, attracting labor forces from all over the Soviet Union. One of the main reasons for urban growth is that more than half of the local population in Kogalym and Nadim is employed in extractive industries, oil and gas, and transport. It also affects the municipal income growth generated by oil and gas production. As a result, the cities also experience steady growth of housing construction, which increases the area of the urban built environment. Historically, economic and housing development partially determine the urban landscape. However, each city has had their own ways of harmonizing relations with the natural landscape. Among the studied cities, Salikhard is the oldest one. It was founded as a trading and military post in Odorsk in 1635. In 1933, it received its current name and city status. The city became an important transportation hub because of oil and gas discoveries. In addition, with the founding of the Yamal-Nenets Autonomous District as its capital, Salikhard became an important administrative center. Stary, meaning old in Russian, Nadim, founded in 1929, was the first permanent settlement in the region. From 1949 to 1956, its railway stations served the area around Nadim, including the Gulag camps, the prisoners of which built the Chum-Salikhard-Igarka railway, later abandoned in 1956. In the 1960s, when rich natural gas reserves were discovered, contemporary Nadim was founded as a base for shift workers. In 1972, it transformed into a city with a permanent population. The origins of Kogalym can be traced to the discovery of oil deposits in 1971. A small settlement was founded in 1976 to serve the railroad construction as a train station. In 1985, it received city status. In 1972, the Uzbelikskaya oil expedition drilled an exploration well on the Povkovsky field, which marked the start of the development of the Kogalym oil region. Although Nadim, Kogalym, and Salikhard have quite similar environmental conditions, based on our disciplinary backgrounds and specific local practices of harmonization of relations with nature, we provide examples of public green, blue, and white spaces as well as their nighttime lighting. In the forest tundra region with permafrost occurrences, the most suitable place for city construction is on the sandy floodplains. Due to rapid population growth, construction started to take place in adjacent swamplands that were filled with sand. An analysis of satellite imagery clearly reveals considerable efforts to preserve, sustain, and even expand the city's green spaces. From 1968 to 2012, the share of green spaces decreased from 55.5% to 32.7% of total urban space. Some formerly sandy areas, however, have been greened. Silt was brought from the Nadim River floodplain to cover the sand with soil. Inspired by mosaics of satellite images, artist Zoysa Lutina used watercolors to interpret changing proportions of green, blue, and other spaces where the sand dominated. She took a thick thread and dipped it in ultramarine and then rolled it on an etching machine so that the paint flowed, symbolizing the fluidity of water. The artist poured each color drop onto wet paper in a certain proportion to the others, allowing them to connect and interact to illustrate human modifications of landscapes. She allowed the paint to mix and then drew defined boundaries using a watercolor-resisting medium and filled the fragments with the related shades of sand, water, and forest. She finished each polygon with colored pencils, further segmenting it. From an interview. Here is the kindergarten Solnishka. That is what's green around it. It has also grown for the last 30 years, probably 40, because there was a lot of sand. Especially when the wind blew in the summer, you would walk down the street and have sand on your lips painted with lipstick, sand in the hair. It was the greening of the city that was actively carried out so that the sand did not fly so much. New green areas were formed in immediate proximity to apartment blocks and along streets. Most of the artificial plantings take place along the central streets of the city. The industrial zone, in contrast, is often covered by wild vegetation. Kozlov's Park in the city center is popular among citizens and serves as a focal point for the city. Most of the city's public institutions, such as sports facilities, cultural centers, the registry office, school, and kindergarten, are concentrated around the park, making it attractive for public use. It did not exist in the original master plan. The city builders had to send requests to the planning agencies for making changes in the master plan to preserve this park. Residents' maintenance of their urban parks and the urban heat island effects is reflected in the tree heights. Trees in Kozlov's parks are statistically significantly taller, 982 plus or minus 220 centimeters, than corresponding undisturbed areas, 827 plus or minus 218 centimeters. From an interview. These wooden houses have a lot of greenery and interesting porches with front gardens. There are raspberries growing here and flowers there. Some porches in the summer are covered with mosquito nets or tulle fabrics. I once saw tables set up and people drank tea, ate, and talked. Thus, the trees and parks serve as indicators of human impact on the urban forest. Until the early 1970s, this hard-to-reach, swampy area was home only to deer-breeding Hunty tribes of the Sapochin and Yermakov families. In the Hunty language, Kogalym means swamp or bad place due to the poisonous gas emitted from the ground. However, the railroad builders found the natural environment as an attractive place for settlement construction. The green spaces of the city are formed by three axes: Rybinové Boulevard, Mura Alley, and the embankment with its recreation area. The first builders did not raise a hand to cut down majestic trees. They tried to plan houses so as to not touch this pristine beauty. And today, next to the high-rise buildings, there are centuries-old cedars and pines. From an interview. You leave from us and walk across the road, and there is a public garden. This is also wildlife. A piece was left there. Birch, spruce, poplar, pine, mountain ash, willow, and wild rose are planted along the city streets. Most of these trees have been grown in local nurseries. Rybinové Boulevard was created in 2004 in dedication to the 10-year Lukoil Jubilee. The boulevard is laid near the headquarters of Lukoil, one of the largest Russian oil companies. The construction of the boulevard took place in the swampy area. Now the boulevard is perceived as an attractive area and a peculiar genius loci. The straight lines and geometric forms of the city were designed without taking into account the specifics of the natural environment. I note the landscape was changed in accordance with the ideas of the ideal urban walking area. Built in the center of the boulevard, the Drop of Oil monument exemplifies the strong dependence of the city on oil extraction. Lukoil is the major job and income-providing company for the city. The oil deposits are located in close proximity to the city and ensure its existence for the next decades. Open blue spaces in the Nadim study area include several lakes. Lake Yantarnaya is the biggest natural lake in the area. Two artificial lakes, or sand dugouts, unofficially called Second Yantarne and Prodolgavate, were created during the development of the city. The depth of these dugouts is more than 10 times deeper than that of natural lakes, so they do not freeze through to the bottom and do not have an ice floor. This makes them more attractive for summertime recreational activities. The artificial and natural lakes differ by color. While the natural lakes are often muddy and covered in places by algae, the artificial lakes look more blue and clear. Interpreting the diversity of colors, Zosia Lutina again used a thread dipped into ultramarine and created a approximate time-lapse of blue color mosaics from a muddy tundra to clear artificial lakes. In 2018 and 2019, city authorities built an embankment along the Yantarnaya Lake shore in the city center. In contrast, blue spaces located in the industrial zone of the city face littering. The main industrial enterprises of Salihard are connected with water resources. The waters of Salihard, located next to the industrial zones, are characterized as dirty. They have increased concentrations of oil products, phenols, heavy metal ions, organic and biogenic substances, and conditionally pathogenic microflora. One of the main tasks in solving the environmental problems of Salihard is effective treatment and disinfection of wastewater. The deterioration and insufficient capacity of equipment of treatment facilities contributes to pollution. For example, on the banks of the Palui River, in addition to fishing, the townspeople keep garages and boats, repair and wash cars, engage in economic activities, barbecue, and children play in the ruins of old ports and ships. The Palui River tributary Shaitanka now has a bank sewn into granite. However, for more than 5 years, the embankment has been a dull, empty territory, inaccessible for walking and recreation due to fenced-off construction taking place in the neighboring area. In 2020, the Salihard authorities presented a preliminary project for transforming the embankment, the implementation of which, according to them, would take about 5 more years. Salihard is located in the permafrost zone with many rivers and thermokarst lakes around it. Current permafrost degradation causes activation of thermokarst, cryogenic landslides, and coastal erosion. The area around Kogalum is indented by channels, lakes, in the Inguyagun and Kuril-Visyagun river systems. The city is located on the 2 banks of the Inguyagun River. The construction of the city began on the left bank, where a settlement was built for the first disembarkation of builders and oilmen pioneers. Later, the central part of the city began to develop on the opposite bank. As in other cases of our study, the city could afford improvement on the Inguyagun riverbank and to strengthen and protect it from erosion. Installation of fencing and construction of footpaths on the embankment has made it one of the favorited places for public recreation and walks. The white snow-covered space dominates the region for about 8 months, from mid-June to the mid-end of September. In October, when the snow cover is just established, there is no difference between the city and the surrounding area. By February, snow cover on the streets is less visible than around the city due to the practice of snow removal and pollution. By April, snow disappears in the areas of heavy traffic, along the roads and in the courtyards. At the beginning of May, white spaces disappear in the city, although snow can still lie around the city for almost a month. In June, snow and ice are still present on the lakes and wetlands. Many people use this path in the summer for a shortcut, and in winter there are cars driving. Because of the construction of the asphalt road with high curbs there and cars cannot cross this curb, in winter it is all compacted with snow, and they drive through. As in other northern cities, winter in Kogalum is snowy, frosty, and windy. From an interview, Very harsh winter. Unusually rapid changes in temperatures and pressure, with temperatures at night being -48 degrees and then -5 by the evening. These are the most vivid impressions. When I run from the store towards home, where we lived, and my bag bursts from the cold and all of my groceries fall out. Or when once again I run and the sole of my shoe bursts from the cold. In the winter, the brightest living spots on the city streets are dark green spruces and pines. Kogalym is one of the few cities where the authorities can afford building greenhouses with subtropical plants. Selikhard, the only city in the world that is located directly on the Arctic Circle. The climate here is very harsh. Below freezing temperatures persist until mid-May. Artificial lighting is an additional way of modifying the natural environment for human needs. Light plays a significant role in the quality of human life. Previously, architects had to rely on the use of daylight in their constructions. However, after the discovery of electricity, the use of natural daylight diminished. Artificial light enhances everyday life by improving color reproduction for people and making the perception of objects better than in natural light. The important goal for the researchers and decision-makers involved in landscape and urban planning is to find the right balance between the tools, methods, and extent of using artificial light for landscape domestication. The use of artificial light becomes especially important in the polar regions where the duration of the polar night, as well as the level of solar radiation, varies significantly depending on the latitude. The Arctic cities are especially illustrative for studies of relations between artificial light and landscapes due to the differences in duration of winter nights. Well-lit urban spaces are celebrated and promoted by the Winter Cities movement as a way to enhance their livability. Artificial lighting is used at all levels of domesticated landscapes, from industrial enterprises and street lighting of cities to growing plants at home. For example, building illumination is very popular in the studied cities. Money spent by municipalities on illumination for a significant part of the year is generally perceived positively. The backlighting of buildings is provided not only by corporations or municipal authorities, but sometimes people make backlights in their own private homes as well. If you walk in the dim in the evening, you will see that almost half of the windows have a characteristic pink light. This is because there are a lot of plants grown on windowsills. There's a strong craving for earth. They grow more than just flowers. It is almost an indispensable element of every home. This backlight allows residents to grow plants when there is a lack of sunlight. The parks are well lit and there is a cedar grove even on the city outskirts. There are interesting lanterns in the form of persimmons. Such an association arises, the fact that in shape they are similar to royal shades and the lighting is so orange, warm. The sources of lights have a significant impact on everyday lives. New LED lights gradually replace incandescent lights and provide better road visibility for drivers. The increased use of street and building lights create the phenomenon of sky glow. The main attraction of the Arctic cities, the northern lights, can be seen from September to March, but due to the city lights, you have to go out of town to catch the lights. From an interview, there is a neighborhood near us, and this year they installed such bright lighting. Usually, we were watching the northern lights from the window, and now these lanterns give a reflection, and you can hardly see anything. This period of prolonged darkness is followed by white nights, which also requires some adaptation for settlers. From an interview, white nights are something amazing, because I could not sleep in principle, and when I go on an expedition in the summer, there is just an incredible kind of cheerfulness when the weather is sunny. Time is completely lost. While artificial lighting is an important part of the Arctic city life, on a global scale it is a large source of carbon dioxide, and applied street lighting systems are often ineffective because most of the emitted light is wasted. Therefore, the Arctic cities face a dilemma between enhanced visibility of proximal objects and decreased sight of the aurora borealis and other natural colors. In the 1970s and 80s, builders from all of the Soviet republics participated in urban and industrial development of the Arctic and subarctic Western Siberia. Each group was bringing their own views and experience of human-nature relations and domesticated landscapes accordingly. The resulting cultural landscapes are reflective and constitutive of specific cultural practices. Some footprints are more evident, such as street names. The others may have disappeared, but can be traced in history. Here we focus on the practices of the construction of Kogalim by Lithuanian builders. 2 units of Lithuanian road and housing builders were sent to develop the territory of the future city of Kogalim in 1980, which later became an element and a node in the network of the social and technical infrastructure of the so-called oil cities. The first groups of Lithuanian road construction workers arrived in Siberia by train and by plane in August 1980. Soon they were joined by builders from Kaunas, who started building high-rise residential buildings in Kogalim. Lithuanian specialists had to learn how to work under very difficult climatic and geological conditions, to build bridges and lay roads in swampy locations. The specialists of both Lithuanian companies in the beginning had some technological problems working in the harsh Siberian climate, but they quickly found solutions. Lithuanian enterprises had to start creating their economic and residential base from scratch, using materials brought from Lithuania. A similar practice was employed by the nearby Latvian and Estonian construction firms. The Baltic workers who participated in the creation of the Tumen oil and natural gas extraction complex sought to reconstruct unique models of their faraway homelands. The Lithuanian microdistrict mostly consisted of individual single-family dwellings constructed from panels. The so-called Alytukas houses were named after a Lithuanian city where this style of houses was developed. The Alytukas, a pan or modular house, represented mass rural architecture, which phenomenally spread throughout the whole territory of the Lithuanian Republic towards the end of the Soviet period. However, the Alytukas that had become so characteristic of the Lithuanian landscape at the time did not suit the harsh Siberian climatic conditions. Local Kogalim residents refer to them as prefabricated Finnish houses to this day. The characteristic attempts of Lithuanian urban planners to preserve the relief and natural surroundings in mass construction territories are also reflected in the landscape of this northern city. The masterful thoroughness of Lithuanian settlement in the taiga was noted in the regional Tumen press of the 80s. Being accustomed to protecting nature in their homeland, they try to preserve the trees as much as possible. In the north, before swinging an axe on a 2-inch wide pine tree, it should be remembered that it takes it dozens of years to grow to this size. From an interview. At first, I looked at the village from afar. It was just so beautiful. I already said that our village was bulldozed. All the trees were demolished, houses were put up in bulk, then anyone who wanted to started planting trees, and the Balts preserved this nature. They somehow planned it all in advance. If they had a cottage and 20 centimeters from it stood a pine tree, they somehow managed to preserve it. Work in the northern city was perceived as temporary. Kogalim was not considered as a permanent or long-term residence for Lithuanians. However, unlike many other new northerners, they encouraged families to settle. Gradually, alongside other necessary facilities such as a board office, different utility buildings, warehouses, a boiler, a vehicle garage, and more, and social institutions such as a cafeteria, a store that sold goods from Lithuania, a club, a medical station, saunas, and more, the territory of RCB-12 became a little Lithuania. Greenhouses, intended to provide for the board workers, were installed under the leadership of Goda Jankauskienė, a trained biologist. They produced vegetables and flowers that amazed the locals at the frequently organized shows, as it was very difficult to grow anything under such harsh climatic conditions. Lithuanian specialists in Siberia successfully created an autonomous oasis of Lithuanian life and activity, which they not only nurtured, but also tried to pass on, through common work and life, by maintaining regular contact with Lithuania, raising their children the Lithuanian way at their own kindergarten and primary schools, and marking traditional celebrations and more. The specific experience of living in the north formed the collective Siberian identity among the Balts, which remained even once they had returned to their homelands. Urban master plans usually designate the location of roads and paths in the city. However, residents may have their own opinions on where to walk. Informal pathways designate those directions of pedestrian and vehicle flows that are important for people but have been overlooked by urban planners and builders. These roads provide shortcuts and form a specific ornament that is more proximate to the natural than built environment directed by sharp geometry of the urban builders. In this work, I, as an artist, study the morphology of pedestrian flows in the city using drone imagery, Google Maps, OpenStreetMap, and the Strava app. The Strava app has already been utilized by researchers interested in studies of commuting and general mobility spatial patterns. The main focus of my research was the pathway network in the city of Nadim in comparison with my hometown of Akademgorodok in Novosibirsk. The Akademgorodok is comparable to Nadim by size and population. However, it is more southern, and the number and activity of city residents and social resources such as OpenStreetMap and Strava differ between Nadim and Akademgorodok, with low activity in the former and high activity in the latter. What I found was that the pedestrian network of the city of Nadim is quite robust, with several major routes and very few unofficial pathways. In OpenStreetMap, the highly developed grid of paths between courtyards and adjacent squares in the surrounding forest are very visible in Akademgorodok. Strava app users in Nadim have laid no more than 10 spontaneous paths throughout the city, and the path maps are sometimes random and incomplete, which may be explained by a smaller number of users. The Strava users' pathways in Akademgorodok look like a fishing net with a diamond-shaped mesh intertwining the entire area. In Nadim, the morphology of the paths practically repeats the city plan and only rounds it off, making it more streamlined and also complicates it with an additional network of a few paths in open places. Created by pedestrians, cyclists, and skiers, the spatial pattern of pathways is representative of the city itself. It highlights the outlines of the buildings in Nadim that have their own specific long and curvy shapes. First, I drew these pathways on paper. The whole districts and transportation nodes became parts of the black and white ornaments. Then I imprinted the most prominent fragments of urban pedestrian routes in the plaster plaques. These drawings and plaster plaques create a visual image of the city of Nadim created by pedestrians' feet. While as an artist I was mostly drawn by the geometries of lines and forms created by pedestrians, the practices and approaches behind these pictures need to be further examined by researchers. The presentation focuses on a site-specific public art installation called Habitation Islands on the bank of the Poloi River in Selihard. Riverbanks in northern cities have become a border zone between nature and humans. Sometimes they become a place where humans leave their garbage and nature reclaims it as part of itself. The coast in Selihard has not been cleaned for years, storing besides solid household waste, old ships, destroyed piers, and river ports on the embankments. Thus, garbage becomes part of the natural and urban landscape. Harsh weather conditions and proximity to water contribute to shaping it in the forms of natural sculptures. Many abandoned objects, distorted by nature, are interesting in their artistic properties and need to be rethought. These strange, abstract sculptures awaken an imagination that connects the embankment, the history of abandoned objects, and the gaze of an observer. We begin to think of decaying garbage not as waste, but as a building material provided by nature itself. As an artist, I am interested in capturing how nature is reclaiming abandoned buildings, various objects, remnants, and ruins. These objects created for specific purposes return to a pure form after losing their initial utilities, and thus require artistic reflection and an ecological response. The project that I represent, Habitation Islands, is a sculpture or a series of sculptures at human height and higher on the banks of the Poloi River in Selihard. The sculptures are composed of debris found on the beach and concrete or an environment-resistant polymer. These are models, small islands made of plaster, in which the found objects and garbage are located. When the gypsum froze, we got white islands with strange things stuck in them. Having lost their everyday functions, they now resembled some kind of natural objects. These strange abstract sculptures awaken the imagination and create a connection between the embankment, the history of abandoned objects, and the gaze of the beholder. When creating the sculptures project, I was inspired by images of local nature. I would like them to resemble tundra bumps or islets of life. Due to their fractality, mosses resemble Jackson Pollock's artistic experiments, in which we are amazed by the diversity and unity of existence. The theme of islands in my work appeared due to the rethinking of the landscape of Salihard, which is saturated with various islands, hummocks, thermokarst lakes, swamps, and small rivers. The concept of the islands refers to the question of the migration of life, its simultaneous expansion and isolation. During my visit to Salihard, local residents who I talked with described the city not as a homeland, but as a place of work or a forced stay. The project aims to develop a sense of space and to evoke an emotional attachment to it as a home by inviting volunteers to participate in this public art project. The main objective of these two exhibitions was to explore the consequences of climate change and the adaptation strategies of local communities in the Arctic and subarctic regions. For the exhibitions, artists worked in collaboration with scholars of natural and social sciences to create over 30 works. Today, I will speak about two works, Terra Constructor and the ArtScience installation Dialogue Between Land and Sea. Both installations were created in collaboration with the scholars Anna Nemchinova, a specialist in biology studies, and Antonina Kulyasova, a sociologist. Considering the new conceptual framework of domesticating landscapes, we are putting the artwork's meaning together again. Do we consider a piece of art to be a way to look beyond the invisible? This object, in the form of a geological time slice crowned by a landscape model, questions the possibility of a pristine landscape to exist in the Anthropocene age. Our knowledge about the world is based on scientific research, which allows us not only to focus on the surface, but to understand what is underground. Danita Pushkareva's work is the connecting point between landscape and historical time. If you draw the entire history of the Earth on a meter ruler, and then mark the history of mankind, then in comparison, mankind only takes up a strip of time smaller than 1 millimeter. When I was choosing a landscape for the Terra Constructor sculptures, I wanted to create an image of a piece of a pristine Russian forest, embedded into the picture of the geologic universe. The visual material of the forests in the upper Soyan River, having inspired the artist, was collected during a scientific expedition in 2019, the purpose of which was to record the manifestations of climate change in this region. Sociologist Antonina Kulyasova, a member of the expedition, said that her interactions with the very old trees turned her attention to thinking about history. This is reminiscent of the principle of experiencing time through material objects, founded in the work of Danita Pushkareva. We live at the very top of the Quaternary strata, which was formed over the course of 2.5 million years. However, those fossils, crude oil and coal, that people use today on an ever-increasing scale are older deposits that lie deeper than the deposits of the Quaternary period. Like geological forces, people are extracting fossils. As a result, the territories that are not affected by human activity directly are still affected by global changes. The oil distribution is total. Oil became the vicious, wrong side of objects and new intensity of people and cargo mobility. In the intact forest, the artist is detecting only a semi-pristine landscape. It was the only option in the Anthropocene age. In this project, we explored scientific and symbolic meanings of the relations between people and landscapes, including their interpretations through religious images. We see the White Sea coastline in a small village. Often, the seashore is a space of harmony and recreation. Nowadays, it has become a risk area due to climate change issues. Perdominsk is a village on the Onega Peninsula on the south side of the White Sea. This place is a magnet that pulls artists towards this phenomenon. Ready found objects, drawings, photos, videos, and soil and water samples collected and created by several artists complement each other in a spatial installation called Dialogue Between Land and Sea. What question could evoke the crossing meanings of these artworks? Do we believe by transforming the landscape that we are providing a safe and sustainable domesticated space for living, or are we causing its degradation? Coastal erosion in Perdominsk is caused by a compounded impact of several effects. Natural, such as sea wave action, surge waves, ebb currents, human activity, and global climate disimbalance causing ice shores and more frequent storms. Human intervention, construction of a 100-meter-long pier in the late 19th century, exacerbated natural effects. The pier became a barrier in the way of sandshore drift that could have compensated for the erosion. In the mid-20th century, the degradation of the coast became visible, and during several decades, the shore shrinked within the range of 1 to 10 meters. People tried to defend the coast with concrete slabs, metal garbage heaps, and wooden seawalls, but with no success. Many constructions built in the previous years were destroyed by the storm in 2015. The coast was unprotected and began to degrade faster. The coastline approached a remaining tower of an old monastery of Perdominsk. The threat of monastery destruction mobilized the community to use coastal management strategies aimed to slow down or prevent further erosion. The Perdominsk local artist Yekaterina Sedacheva is reflecting the labor of several generations of peninsula settlers in a religious context. Symbolic context of salvation is incorporated in her works, appearing either in found driftwood or in drawings. This is an example of a fish image in her visions. Contemporary artist Masharu approached the situation in Perdominsk from another perspective, trying to discover what is beneath the Earth's surface through collecting samples of clay, peat, wood, and water from this particular place. The artist considers the process of soil eating as the gesture of soil appropriation and returning the earth value. Dialogue between two artists as a quintessence of dialogue between land and sea concludes by the installation of floats collected by Yekaterina Sedacheva. It represents these old pieces of wood, carved by water, wind, and sand, as symbols of hope for people to be able to stay on the coast in their domesticated environment.